Let me go ahead and introduce my guest, ladies and gentlemen. This nice gentleman sitting here, by the way, he was on my show before about 12 years ago, so this is the second time that my good friend here, David Scott Strain, who's on Communicating Today. Strain is an Army veteran. He's a businessman and an author, and he served 12 years of active duty in the United States Army. He was twice injured in training in the Army, and he's listed officially as partially disabled and receives a small monthly compensation because of his injuries. He earned 2 degrees from college while in the military, an electronic engineering degree and a computer science degree. He exited military service after 12 years with an honorable discharge to pursue a civilian career in information technology as an executive, and is now in the process of authoring a second book, and he's partially retired. So without further ado, my good friend for the second time, Mr. David Scott Strain. David, thank you so much for being here. How do you like that introduction?
Wonderful,
Pretty
John.
cool, isn't it?
Thank you very much.
I rehearsed it for about 2 days.
I've got more bona fides if anybody wants them. You know, we're going to start off talking about, you know, the general high-level problems at the VA, and they get into some detail. We don't have a lot of time, but hopefully we'll hit some highlights. And we're going to talk about a poor customer service ethic as paired with misunderstanding of the customer class. I'd like to read something from a transcript, a recording I made that really sets the tone. Someone was very unguarded. It was a patient advocate about 3 years ago, and nothing has changed. Listen to this. I've worked at 4 clinics. I've never worked at a VA that's had this much opposition towards the vets. Note he doesn't say this clinic has opposition. All 4 did, but this one has the most. There's a feeling of every other Friday, the eagle lays a golden egg and we all get our paycheck. A lot of people here, that's why they're here, unfortunately, without an effective management. Then you have people here that do the very bare minimum. It's like electricity, seeking the least resistance. What is the least amount of work that I can do and get away with and still draw a paycheck every other Friday? It's a morale indicator, and that's something that Wilkie himself talked about, bad morale across the whole of the VA. Now, we've got patient advocates that don't understand the customer class. Veterans are dying, family members are angry, veterans get angry. What happens when veterans have their life in the balance, the quality of their care in the balance? Well, a very unfortunate thing happens. Let's go to this next slide if we could, please. We got a poor customer service ethic. The customer class, how are they misunderstood? What are veterans trained to do? They're trained to win wars. We can say, well, they defend the nation, but the Pentagon is called the War Department. It's chiseled in cement. That was the original name. How do you win wars? You hold ground and you advance on ground. When veterans come to complain, and let's use the word complain, about their health care, the quality of service, whether people listen to them or not, the last thing you want is a clinic manager who rebuffs them or rebuffs a family member, and we'll get into specifics. That is tragic. We end up with divides in communication between staff and patients, and we have expectations being set without deliveries being made.
So what we're talking about basically, David, is we're zeroing in on this show a very large government agency, United States government agency called the Department of Veterans Affairs, which used to be called the Veterans Administration, which takes care of 21 million veterans. You're one of them, and I'm one of them. You were in for 12 years. I was in for 2 years, and you had a problem, and you had an injury, and you're receiving benefits. I was lucky I got through it without any injuries, and I was not in when they were shooting at each other. It was not a shooting war.
Right.
I was in during peacetime, so I was lucky in that regard.
You mentioned my
so
injuries.
You're talking about some of the good things that are happening in the VA, and some of the bad things that are happening. A lot of bad things are happening at the Veterans Administration. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I did suffer egregious injuries due to malpractice and malfeasance, subsequent malfeasances. Let's get right into the malfeasance part of it, because this tracks with something else also. My fees were held up for 2 years due to malpractice and a drug that was lied about to me about its suitability to my treatment and its side effects. I passed out at the wheel of a car on a trip coming here 4 years ago for business. I smashed into a tree at 70 miles an hour off the interstate. I thank goodness that I didn't injure anyone else.
You're lucky to be here today, that's
I broke
for sure.
my back, sternum, ribs, arm, wrist, was concussed, tore my bladder, and I have to use these the rest of my life. These don't embarrass me. These are catheters, and I've inserted about 12,000 of them,
Wow.
thanks to VA healthcare.
Wow.
Now,
amazing.
they denied my fees. This is going to be on YouTube so people can take their time with this very busy slide. But what they do, they lie. Let's call it what it is. First, they said my bills weren't submitted in 90 days. I showed they were. Then they said I hadn't been treated in a VA facility in the preceding 24 months, implying I wasn't a patient, and on and on and on. When I overcame each of these objections and resubmitted the bills, they start at the top of the stack with more excuses.
Yeah.
This is why veterans get angry. Dead-end phone trees, people who pledge to do something but then don't fulfill the expectations.
Yeah.
And then when the veterans get angry, let's go to the, let's jump to the next slide.
Right.
And let's leap over that one and go to this thing, the Disruptive Behavior Committee. One more slide, please.
Yeah.
When the veterans get angry, they get submitted by a clinic manager or a staff person. The situation gets submitted to something called the Disruptive Behavior Committee. Now that committee is
Accusing the veteran of disruptive behavior.
That's right.
Whether the shoe on the wrong foot.
Whether the veteran was disruptive or not, you can be perfectly decorous.
Yeah.
But if they don't like what you're exposing,
Yeah.
they manufacture tone, content of what you're saying, and will even ascribe actions to you that you did not perform. You don't get a hearing. What happens is you get a letter that comes at you sideways in the mail indicating that you're potentially violent and or disruptive. And in my case, I was banned from all clinics except the Columbus Clinic.
Because of disruptive behavior.
Well, so they
You're
claim.
such a nice guy, too.
Thank you.
I can't see how you could be disruptive.
There are people in this town that have known me
When you've
going
had the
on
kind of injuries
30
you've had,
years.
you can be very disruptive, and you're not being treated properly either.
That's a good
not
point.
being cared for properly.
That's a very good point to
Yeah.
make, John. Thank you. And they're not given an opportunity to tell their side of the story. So they do get an appeal. But as I told the patient advocate and the associate director in Columbus, the appeal will be denied. I mounted it because you can't complain about the patient record flag. That's a flag that is on every computer screen, coast to coast, VA-wide, identifying you as potentially violent and or disruptive.
Oh my goodness.
Your care gets channeled to that main clinic, in my case, Columbus. So this is called constriction of care, and it's called denial of benefits.
Oh my God.
I have a letter that says if I hurt myself, like while I'm in travel here, and I can't be seen at Columbus, if I go to a clinic here, even for a couple stitches, I have to pay for that out of pocket. Whereas normally I would have had access to any VA clinic and that would have been covered.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's legal. If it is legal, I don't know why it's legal. That's denial of benefits. We'll talk about the first ever class action lawsuit that was approved to proceed against the VA, and it was won. This is very recent. That's this year. So these clinics, I want to retract. Let's go to the next slide.
There we go.
Actually,
My experiences.
yeah. Well, the yields. I had a malpracticing doctor that I got fired. He tried to reverse my medical timeline, 2 key events. He tried to backfill my medical timeline. That's called discontinuity of treatment records. Normally you want to maintain continuity of treatment records. He also told the clinic manager several falsehoods. She tried to cover for him and sweep problems under the rug. They both ended up getting fired. That clinic manager actually divided her clinic in half and threatened a peer support specialist who helped me and was basically on my side in my view of what had happened to me. Let's go ahead and we'll jump to this next. How does this stuff affect other people? I've been talking to veterans. I met with a combat medic, a woman. We talk about strong women. This is a legitimate, strong woman. 3 combat tour. Very, very strong woman. She's in the middle of her 3rd combat tour. She's ordered to pick up body parts and put them in plastic bags. She broke down when she picked up the head of a 12-year-old Afghan girl she recognized, and all that was left was the head and the legs. She was medically discharged. The Evansville, Indiana VA had her on more than 40 medications. I wasn't sure that was possible. I had to do an internet
40.
search. Johnny Cash was on more than 40. There was an interview by his doctor. So I felt she was credible in mentioning that. Her family had to pull her out of VA health care and get a civilian doctor to do what's called de-prescribing. He got her down to 3 medications. When I mentioned to a Columbus Clinic nurse that, I was aware of all these veterans who were being what's called polypharmacized, anything more than 5 meds, she said, I know veterans here who are on as many as 30 medications. I said, that's, Elvis territory and beyond. How do you sustain that? Why would you do that to someone? She said, you have to understand, some drugs have side effects. You have to prescribe another drug. Then it has side effects and you prescribe another drug. I said, times 30? But they justify this. They're winding a lot of pills through veterans. Now, this Desert Storm vet, 17 meds. I said, 17? He said, yep, 14 in the morning, 3 at night. Wow. I said, how do you feel? He said, like, and it rhymes with hit. I said, well, do you need all those meds? He sighed and said, I don't know. So something really foul is going on here. Another Desert Storm vet who's a personal friend of his is now deceased. He was transferred. Now, I'm not sure he was at Columbus, but he was transferred to the Cleveland Clinic. The Cleveland Clinic had to agitate for his medical records, and they couldn't get him for 3 days. They should have been with him or overnighted. It took 3 days. I don't know if that contributed to his death or not. But what you end up having is staff attack any staff who want to make any revelations for betterment, and staff attack patients who try to bring things forward for betterment. Let's go forward a couple slides, or did we get through them already?
Before you go any further, David, I just got the halfway warning. We're halfway through the program. I told you the program moves very quickly.
Yes.
And it's a 28-minute program, and we just passed the 14-minute. And I want to go back to the camera for a few seconds to reintroduce the program. Ladies and gentlemen watching our show, which is called Communicating Today, and again, introduce myself. I'm the director, the producer of this program, and we're doing show number 787 tonight with my wonderful guest for the second time. He's been on our program before, Mr. David Scott Strain, who is a 12-year Army veteran who was injured in the service, and he's collecting a partial disability. And he's talking about an agency called the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is the second largest government agency after the Department of Defense. And they take care of 21 million veterans every year. And he was one veteran that was not treated according to, he's reciting a litany of things that have happened to him, and he's very unhappy with the situation. That's not to say that the Veterans Administration doesn't do a lot of good things for a lot of people, but they also do some bad things for a lot of people. And what we got to do is try to clean up the agency and make it appropriate, make it work and function better. And that's what David's talking about tonight on our show.
Let's talk about what I saw at a satellite clinic of Columbus. This is really important. I saw elder abuse. The mood of the waiting room was very bad when I entered it. I was early for my appointment. There was a nurse who was singing and giggling throughout the morning, and he didn't close the exam room door, so he continued to sing and giggle while the appointments were going on. He came out. There was a deaf World War II veteran, about 95, I would estimate, with a ball cap, hearing aids. I had said good morning, and he hadn't heard me. The nurse stood behind his chair, the guy who had been giggling. He shouted straight down at the top of his head, "Hello, hello, hello. If you can hear me, you can come in now." The man simply looked straight ahead. He didn't hear a thing. The nurse looked out over the waiting room as if it was a comedy club audience, giggling anew. He yelled down a second time the same thing. "Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? If you can hear me, you can come in now." Now this gentleman struggled to turn to see what was going on above him. Now the nurse yelled straight down into his face a third time. And just so the audience knows, "Hello, hello, hello," same litany. "If you can hear me, you can come in now," giggling at the end of it each time. The man struggled out of the chair. I had a briefcase and my laptop on my lap. I didn't know if I should help the man. I wear a brace on my ankle from my injuries from malpractice. I said, but if I drop the guy, I'm going to be in trouble. They went into the room. I was so uncomfortable by what I was seeing that morning. I went to the counter to report it. They laughed when I said, there's a nurse back there giggling and singing. They laughed. I said, I don't find it funny. He's mocking a deaf World War II veteran. The man sat stone-faced looking at his intake computer. So I said, go ahead and cancel my appointment. They were running more than an hour behind a mere 1 hour into the business day. So that was more, in my mind, malfeasance. When I tried to report this to the clinic manager, who is also the patient advocate, a huge conflict of interest, we see that on the screen now, she refused to take the report. Further, she told me I could not talk to veterans in that clinic because I had tried to solicit a witness. I said, well, I can talk to veterans, they're my peers. She told me, no, you cannot talk to veterans here, and she charged the intake person. She gestured and yelled, call the police. She spun around and snarled at me, is that what you want? And I said, of course not. That's not a good use of police resources. She spun back, said, call the police again. I didn't know it, but the panicked woman at the intake counter pressed an alarm button twice. 2 police cars were dispatched. I didn't know that. I drove home and worked the rest of that afternoon. I was on the phone with clients. A week later, I get a letter in the mail from the Disruptive Behavior Committee that we mentioned earlier, saying I'd been flagged as disruptive, that I was yelling, I'm going to sue the VA, which at that time, you couldn't sue the VA. I knew that. The clinic knew that I knew that because I had articulated that about my tort claim. And so I then was banned from all these other clinics. Now, I hope we're going to have time for this. This is really choice, and I'm going to read something. I was talking.
You're doing a great job so far,
well,
Dave.
thanks.
It's terrific.
Thanks for letting me get this out.
Keep up the good work.
I was talking to the acting public affairs director, I believe it was, and her admin assistant, and I was standing at a service counter, which is a barrier, let's face it, and they were on the other side listening to my story about what had happened to me and about what Wes Landry had said, and they were riveted. The supervisor of patient advocates snuck up behind me and was hovering back there listening in. And I was telling them, I'm being forced to drive for some appointments 68 miles when I could go a mere 7 because I've been banned from all the satellite clinics. I said, it's bad to get stuck in traffic, rush hour coming into Columbus, or if there's an accident, I said, I have to use catheters. And I said, that's a hardship. And I went like this, and I put it down on the service counter. Here's what they did. They extended my patient record ban by saying this. On February 22nd, 2019, during your unscheduled contact with 2 VA employees, there were actually 3, you exhibited a physically aggressive behavior. Your use of an inanimate object to repeatedly strike the desk of a VA employee is considered to be a physical threat to the safety of our staff. They were all more than 2 arms lengths away from me. Their desk was 15 or 20 feet behind the service counter, a physical barrier, and the other desk was in a private office. And I did this like a fly swatter one time. So they're claiming that this is like wet spaghetti.
Yeah.
And you know where this goes. You know where this goes. So, you know, this is not a weapon, VA. This is not a weapon. Yeah. And you cannot repeat it.
It goes somewhere where the sun don't shine.
You cannot repeat it. Thank you, John. You cannot repeatedly slam this, or what did they say, to repeatedly strike the desk. And these can break. This has lubricant, and these often break in transit, in the mail when they come to you. Mine didn't break. I put it back in my pocket. I have to use these things. So this is the level of lies that they will tell.
This is such a serious situation, and there's a little bit of comical relief here that you've just inserted into this very, a very serious problem.
I have had to have the best sense of humor in the world. This is all tragic comic, though. When you talk to other veterans, they're over-prescribing meds. They are pushing procedures. They tried to make me have a prostate biopsy that I did not need. I did my own research. And when they say a prostate biopsy, they make it sound like they take a single core out of your prostate. No, they drill it 12 times through a very sensitive area, and you can risk blood sepsis, which is blood infection, and you can lose extremities. Now, the markers that were indicating I have that, test, that biopsy, were not very strong. And then they reversed and went down. I was saying, let's wait longer. I feel that I was proved right, and I think I had the better course of action versus my doctor. Now, I have been rebuffed by the associate director. She gave me her business card. She pledged to collaborate with me on clinic betterment, but she had been in her job only 1 month. And at the end of an ad hoc meeting, on the spur of the moment that lasted more than an hour, that she extended by walking us to the elevator, she said, we're going to collaborate. When I got my patient record flag, she stopped answering phone calls. She closed her door to me. She doesn't answer emails. The same thing has happened with Mr. Manat. He's the chief of veteran experience. There's a new veteran experience office that kind of hovers over patient advocacy, and he is supervisor of patient advocates. They will turn you out based on politics. And I told Ms. Cooney when I met her, I said, this sounds good, us working together. I said, but the challenge for you will be to avoid the politics of the fourth floor. You will be told you're not going to work with a veteran to improve the clinic. She said, don't worry, that won't happen. Well, that was the early version of Ms. Cooney before the VA. I call it a stink stew of a culture. And if you want to remain in that culture, in that clinic, you have to adopt the ways of the people around you, or they're going to retaliate against you and move you out. Now, it's supposed to be getting better, but I don't see the evidence of that. Now,
well, there's a lot of morale problems at the Department of Veterans Affairs, that's for sure. And you and I were discussing it before the program. We agreed that there's a lot of morale problems with the staff, the personnel, the employees that work within the DVA, people that work there, doctors and nurses and administrative people and so forth. Very big morale problem. They're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing, and they're doing the wrong things. And there's a big morale problem with the veterans group that is being treated. These 21 million veterans that come to the VA facilities. So you got a morale problem on both sides. The people that work there and the people that are being treated there, the veterans, the patients, the veterans, the 21 million veterans that we talked about before. So we've got a new director in there, a new administrator who's trying to figure out. President Trump, when he came in the presidency a couple of years ago, he said he was going to try to do something about improving the situation at the VA. And he has a new director in there. And Robert Wilkie is the new director, the administrator.
Can I interject, John, real quick? Since you mentioned President Trump, the Mission Choice Act, which we were discussing prior, is a glorious thing. It's probably saving my life. I now get to go to a civilian hospital, finally. But I'm sorry to interject that. I did want to mention that.
But there's a lot of good things going on at the veterans because there are 21 million veterans, and they're not all being mistreated. Some are, and in fact, a lot are. And we read about there veterans patients that are waiting for a heart operation or a cancer operation, and they're in a wheelchair or they're in a mobile bed, waiting for to be scheduled for an operation, and they sometimes die in that wheelchair. They die in that mobile bed because they can't get scheduled on time. So there's a big morale problem, and what we're trying to do is find a way to fix it, to correct it. And it's the bureaucracy, and that's what it's all about.
John, I promised
the federal government bureaucracy.
I promised someone I would mention this. I spoke for 56 minutes to the wife of a man who died. Through a whimsical occurrence, I met a Columbus City police officer. And within the space of our first words, she said to me, the VA killed my father. And I next said, I believe you. We talked for an hour while I was eating dinner, waiting for a piano lesson here in Columbus. I said, I'd love to. She said, it happened less than a year ago. My mother's still grieving. I said, I'd be willing to talk to your mother and I'd be interested. She said, I don't know if she'll be able to talk to you. Her mother, after 3 weeks went by, her mother called me. We spoke for 56 minutes. During that call, she began crying a little bit and she recovered her composure. This is what they do to family members. She said her husband was being treated by doctors who, in her words, looked like residents. This was at the Pittsburgh VA. I said, was there any doctor of gravitas who seemed to be in charge, taking charge of anything? She said, no. These young doctors were disrespectful. She came in one day. Her husband was in a bed, dirty clothes, disheveled, complaining that his hip hurt, and he was all, he was doped up. He said, they dropped me. It turned out doctors or nurses dropped him apparently between a wheelchair and the bed. It was a Thursday. She said, we need to x-ray my husband's hip. We're getting down there,
close.
John. We got to get this in. This is important.
Okay.
And she said, we've got to x-ray my husband's hip. It's a Thursday. They said to her, we don't x-ray on weekends. They told her that on a Thursday. He had to suffer Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They got around to x-raying his hip on Monday. They broke his hip by dropping him.
We could go on with this litany of terrible things that are happening at the Department of Veterans Affairs, but we're running out of time. David, thank you so much for being on our program. We got to do an encore show. We got to come back and do a second show, but I got to start thinking about wrapping up. Come back and see us again. We'll keep in touch on what's going on at the department. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have another great show for you next week. We got to go out by saying, first of all, thanking David Scott Strain, who was our wonderful guest for tonight's program. We always go out by saying, keep on communicating for success and wonderful guests, and come back and see us next week for another wonderful show on Communicating Today. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.